Hello and welcome to another edition of Another Book Review. This week I'll be reviewing North and South by Elizabeth Gaskell. This is going to be a spoiler full review. This book is very, very dense, and it's hard for me to really talk about it without going into plot points. So I'll do that. So it'll be spoilers from here on out. Before I go into what the book is about and my thoughts on it, what I liked about it, what I didn't like about it, I'm going to go over the author's history, and then I will finish with who I would recommend the book to. Not sure what I'm going to be reading for next time, so I'll probably leave it there. Elizabeth Gaskell was a Victorian era writer. She wrote a biography of one of the Bronte sisters, as well as three of her own novels. This is one of the most famous ones, but all of her stuff, all three novels have been adapted by the BBC. This story, North and South, this novel, North and South, has been adapted, I believe, three different times, and is probably the best known of her stuff. She also was a short story writer. My understanding is originally this was serialized in one of the magazines that Charles Dickens was associated with. And like Dickens, one of the things that you notice from a modern perspective, it's a very, very wordy book. They say he was paid by the word. You get the feeling that Gaskell was also probably paid by the word. Um, and so my copy was 425 pages, and it's a very, very dense book. There's a lot of allusions to other works of mythology, of English literature. Um, my edition that I read was the classic Penguins Classic Edition. I don't usually go into editions when I read the book because most of this channel, when I read novels, they're relatively contemporary. But this edition has a lot of annotations, and I will say if you're reading the book, you may want to wait till the end to look at the annotations because there's plot points that were spoiled for me when reading it because I was reading the annotations. So just a heads up there. There's an introduction as well. The introduction by Patricia Ingham, which I have not read. So I'm not sure. I can't really speak to that. I'm interested to read that. I just finished this book a little while ago, so I may go back and read the introduction as well, just to get a sense more of the historical importance of the novel. But just to get into it, and I should say uh, my association or my knowledge of Victorian era novels is relatively limited. I don't think I've read a full straight on Victorian novel other than this. The closest thing was Mayor of Casterbridge in high school. I'm not sure if that qualifies. I don't think it does because Mayor of Casterbridge may have been set in New England. So I don't know if that would qualify as not. I've seen Emma and Clueless, so those are Jane Austen stories. But other than that, I have very little knowledge of this. So I just wanted to put that out there because this is if you're someone who's introducing to a modern audience, there are many things that you're going to catch on to very quickly, and I think some of that is the style of the time that I'll talk about here in a minute. Excuse me, but just to get into what the book is really the story of Margaret Hale, who is at the beginning of the novel turned 18, and she is working for her cousin who lives in England, who lives in London, England. She's kind of a handmaiden to her while she is going through an engagement. Her while she's leading up to her cousin being married, and Margaret is kind of the practical person, and her cousin Edith is kind of, for lack of a better word, flighty, and uh, she gets married. Edith is married to a soldier whose name is Lennox, and um, Margaret goes back to uh, the rural area of England, the south of England, that she's from, to stay with her mother and her father, who is I don't know if they say what his title is in the church, but maybe a vicar, and he is kind of a pastoral priest, and he very much likes being there. Her mother is, I think at one point they tell us that she is a school teacher or was a school teacher, and she goes back and for a very brief period of time, excuse me, they're relatively happy, except that uh, her father has something of a change of conscience. This is relatively soon after she gets back, but he has a break from the church and can no longer be a member of the church and serve his pastoral duties. Um, he decides to leave. The only other important thing to note during this time is that uh, two things. There's a brother whose name is Frederick, who was in the Navy, the Royal Navy, and he was part of a mutiny. And there has been a bounty on his head for a long time. And he is not basically able to come to England because there's a fear that if he comes, he's going to be arrested for being a member of this mutiny, ship mutiny, as a member as a sailor with the Royal Navy. Um, the other thing is Edith's husband's brother, uh, also named Lennox. I forget which of the Lennox brothers he is. Um, proposes. He comes to. I'm going to call it Hedgestone. I don't remember the name of the town specifically. They say it a million times, but my memory is so bad. I'll call it Hedgestone. But this kind of area that she lives in, this pastoral area, which was referred to throughout the book, I'm going to call it Hedgestone. Um, Edith's husband's brother, who is a lawyer, comes to offer a proposal to her, which she rejects, a marriage proposal. And she rejects this proposal. There's not a lot about why she rejects the proposal, which is when we get into the pros and cons of the book, I'll get more into. This is going to be a long video. I'm already at 6 minutes. This is great. So her father moves to a town called Milton, which is kind of a stand-in for an industrial town in the north of England, very similar to Manchester. And so Milton is a factory town, and it's very 180 of what it was in the south of England. And Margaret, is kind of taken aback at this. The reason they moved to Milton is because her father has a connection with a guy named Bell, and who he knew in school, I believe, and sets him up as a tutor for a man named Thornton, who is kind of an up-and-coming industrialist in Milton, and he wants to learn classics. And so this is kind of the main back and forth of the novel, between Milton and Hedgestone and Margaret and Thornton. And so during this stretch of the novel, Margaret's trying to get acclimated to the area. It's very, very different than what she's used to growing up, and really even different than being in London. And so she is meeting people. There's a man named Higgins who she comes across one day with his daughter, and she befriends them, even though Higgins has two daughters, and one of them is very sickly, who's, I believe, Bessie, and she ends up dying. And we learn that Higgins is something of a union. He is a union member, and the union has decided to strike in order to get this 5% raise. And so Margaret is kind of caught between worlds, where she is in contact with Thornton because her dad works for Thornton, because he's basically the tutor of Thornton. And she's also knows these people who are also suffering and basically nearly starving to death. There's a term clemming, which I'd never heard before, which is basically starving. There's a glossary in the back of the book, which is really helpful in kind of knowing some of these terms that may be unfamiliar to modern audiences. Bessie dies, and there's a strike. And in this strike, Butcher, who is Higgins' neighbor, basically escalates the strike into violence. And before they can break up the strike, someone throws a rock at Thornton. Margaret gets in the way of the rock and is struck. And Thornton interprets this as kind of feelings towards him, and she rebuffs these feelings very, very quickly and says, "No, I would have done this for anybody. It really wasn't about you, Mr. Thornton." And so he is pretty clearly like taken aback by that. And I believe at this time, Margaret's mother starts dying of, I don't know if it's from it seems it's pretty heavily implied that she dies from being in Milton and the industrial pollution of this place. And there's some footnotes that kind of talk about some of the health issues related to living in this place where there's like all these cotton flakes and all this stuff. But long story short, she's dying. And Frederick, who is in Spain because he's not allowed to be in England, and has recently become engaged to a Spanish woman, is contacted, and he's basically told to risk coming into England in order to um, see his dying mother, which he's able to do. Um, when she is sending him back at the Margaret and Frederick are at the train station. They're about to leave and send Frederick to a lawyer in London who is the same lawyer that Margaret turned down, rejected the marriage proposal for earlier in the book. Someone recognizes Frederick as part of this person who was involved with this mutiny and is about to turn him in. There's a scuffle and he falls and he dies. Uh, at the same time, Thornton saw Frederick and Margaret at the train station together at night, which in Victorian era is very much you. If you were to move, if you were a lady, you were to move with someone um, at night if they were a family member or if they were a lover, basically. And Thornton obviously has feelings for this woman and believes this Frederick is her lover. And so he kind of internalizes this. And long story short, um, the case of the dead man goes to Thornton because at the same time he's a magistrate. And he basically buries this. And even though Margaret is a witness at this murder, he basically buries it for her and it goes away. And then this is where I get kind of confused as far as the major plot points. And then I think the next big thing that happens is her father dies, and Mr. Bell, who is his closest confidant in Oxford, he Mr. Hale, who is the tutor, goes to Oxford to see Bell, who is his old friend, and he dies. Bell is also the godfather of Margaret, who now has had both her parents die, and he basically, for lack of a better word, adopts her and has money and is working with her to just because this girl has been through so much and dealing with her grief and whatnot. And at the same time, I'm trying to think of what happened next here. Uh, they go back to um, her hometown. This is about 3 years have passed in this book. They go back to Hedgestone, and she sees that everything has changed, or a lot of things have changed in that time from what she remembered about her childhood home. They've sold the home. There's a bunch of people who are living in the home, and she is kind of taken aback of just how much has changed in so short of a period of time. Mr. Bell, who's much older, is kind of trying to console her about this, and now this is kind of part of the human condition and all these things. And then he dies. And after Bell dies, I believe he leaves her a bunch of fortune. He leaves her his fortune, and she goes to stay with Edith in London. At the same time, the lawyer is now the lawyer that she's rebuffed and the lawyer that she sent Frederick to has not been able to help Frederick really because there's no witnesses to basically. He needs witnesses to basically come forward and say he wasn't part of this mutiny or the mutiny was done for legally proper reasons per maritime law. And he feels that she's getting closer and closer to him as they have more and more business together. And I think he is kind of believing that even though she rejected him before, she's going to kind of come slowly into his circle because she's dealing with all this business with him as she's made all this money. At the same time, Thornton is kind of ruined by these strikes. He bought a bunch of money, put a bunch of money into equipment, and his fortune has fallen pretty strongly to the point where Margaret kind of steps in and buys his factory. And at the end of the book, Thornton goes to London to talk to Lennox, the lawyer, and ends up talking to Margaret, and they kind of figure out that this person was not her brother was not her lover, and so he had kind of thought of her as a fallen woman. And I'm going back. He had kind of thought of her as a fallen woman and kind of said some things to her that kind of really upset her. And after the proposal, it was rejected. So anyway, we'll get to it. And then just one of many coincidences in this book, coinkydinks, someone basically, I think it's Higgins, tells him, hey, by the way, that was actually her brother, not her lover. and this kind of sets him back to like reestablishing her as like a noble enough person for him to get married to, and then in the final pages, it's kind of implied that they are now to be get together, even though both of the families outside of each other don't really care for one another. Mrs. Thornton, Thornton's mom, really does not care for Margaret, and also Edith, her husband is the other Lennox. His brother, Edith really wants Margaret to basically get married to this lawyer who she doesn't care for, and she's upset that she is going to marry this other guy, Thornton. But that's how the book ends. So it's a very, very convoluted plot. There's a lot of stuff going on. I think I covered about 75% of it in that summary. What did I like about the book? So the book in parts is very funny. I think there are some really quotable lines to the book that I didn't pull, but I thought were really interesting. Where the book I think is its strongest is when it talks about the intersections of class and status in at this time, because Margaret is in some ways a very privileged person. In other ways, she's very not privileged. The book pulls its punches in some ways where every time that she needs money, she has money. And so there's not really quite the sting that you would think with the class intersections. And so the book kind of plays a little fast and loose with some of these things. And there's a lot of contrivances that happen in the book that basically make sure that this woman, who suffered a lot in terms of deaths, but hasn't really suffered a lot in terms of material discomfort, and the book is always there to like make sure that Margaret is taken care of, which from a realistic standpoint was a little frustrating. But so it's interesting because she's staying with her aunt, who basically is a handmaiden for her cousin, who are wealthy in London. And in Hedgestone, they have two servants, one of whom I believe is named Charlotte, who kind of drops out of the book almost immediately. And then the other one who's almost not really introduced. And the other one is Dixon, who is kind of the loyal servant throughout the book. And that character is actually kind of interesting too, because she's a woman in her 50s who has seen some stuff, and she has her own personality, and she kind of holds her own with the family. And I actually like that character. She wasn't like a go along to get along person. She was very much like she had her own opinions, and she liked people and disliked other people. And so I thought that was kind of a pretty realized character, given that they were like secondary or tertiary character. But they moved to Milton, where they're apparently broke, but they still have a servant. Like Dixon is still there. And it's not clear to me like what the actually downside of them move into Milton was in terms of like the money they have available to them. So Thornton is interesting because he is a rags to riches person who didn't have any money given to him in any way, shape, or form. He's kind of the pull you up by your bootstraps type of person. He's built this business. And because of the strike and because he's invested all this money into machinery, and he's basically lost. And he says at the end of the book, I'm basically back to where I started. And really, it's kind of implied that with Margaret's money, he's going to be okay, even though his mother really does not like Margaret for various reasons, most of which I think are kind of earned, to be honest with you. I think in her mind, like, why would you reject my son? And Margaret, to her credit, is not really great at like giving reasons for things in the book, or Gaskell's not really great at giving her reasons for things. And so the reasons why she rejects some people and not others is kind of a mystery. At some point in the book, I was like, is she supposed to be asexual, which was a term that they probably were not using in Victorian era London, but she comes off as somewhat sexless, and she's always kind of worried about other people, and she doesn't have a lot of interiority about what she wants in her drives. So I don't know if that was necessarily just a writer's tool to kind of show you this world, or if this was like done on purpose to show you that like this character is not really someone who, and it's also Victorian era, so you have a lot of censorship going on as well. Censorship in thought, if not necessarily a censorship in like formal censorship. But that was a question of like, well, which of these, she has two of these suitors, but she doesn't seem to really care for either one of them. And even at the end of the book, you're just kind of like, it's never quite clear to me why you rejected this person only to bring it back later. And that transformation is not really super solid. And some of the endnotes she mentions kind of having to be rushed in certain parts of this serialized story. And there are things that were cut for the serialized story. And I guess she came upon the ending, and it got the sense that she maybe wanted to do more with it, though she says she's pretty happy with it. I actually like the very last draft of the book is actually, I thought, relatively strong, because it doesn't really overstay its welcome. It kind of gives you the needed pieces and kind of gets out of the way. The emotional transformation leading up to that that ending, though, I think was a little lacking. Um, yeah, I thought it was an interesting book. I thought that that was the best part of it was really kind of the dealing with class, and you see Higgins who is trying to just like survive. His daughter has died. He has another daughter who's working odd jobs just to make enough money to make it through the winter, and they're striking for like a 5% raise, and just kind of the battle and ideologies between Higgins and Thornton. And then the end of the book, they mention Thornton trying to do some kind of endeavor to trying to mitigate or try to avoid striking workers. And it's not really kind of clear what that would be, but I thought that was kind of an interesting resolution to that as well, where he's kind of basically stopped becoming a businessman, and so his business is now going to be trying to intercede between workers and business owners to try to smooth over labor relations issues, which I thought was kind of interesting. Um, so I thought the book was maybe more interesting than I necessarily enjoyed it. There's, like I said, a lot of plot contrivances and a lot of things that just kind of happen. Thornton seems, it was like, excuse me, Mr. Thornton as a character, it was almost like I was watching The Prestige, where there's like multiple versions of him, where it's like, do you have clones, Mr. Thornton, to where you're everywhere in this book all the time? Um, and so that was one of the things where there's a lot of contrivances that happen, and everyone seems to always run into the right person at the right time. There's a lot of melodrama as far as the deaths. There's deaths upon deaths upon deaths. We didn't really talk about Butcher and Butcher dying and what happens after Butcher dies. But it's a lot. If you like this type of novel or you're interested in reading a Victorian era novel, I think this was well suited to a modern audience. If you can get over some of the flowery prose, it is a lot of it's a book that's not doesn't do a lot of condensing, and it is a book that has a lot of contrivances in the plots, and there's a lot of stuff going on. But I enjoyed the fact that if you read it and are able to strip away a lot of those things, you realize it's really just about the relationship between these characters and the time that they're living in and the class struggles that they have and trying to come to some kind of place of balance in that. And I thought all that was really, really interesting. I think the character of Edith is also like an interesting character who is basically kind of just flies above it all. And she is married, she has a kid, she has money, and so she's just not worried about any of it. And there's like a wonderful line at the end of the book. I'm going to find that line. I'm going to quote the line because this is public domain, so I'm sure at this point they can't sue me. Elizabeth Gaskell cannot come back from the grave to sue me. My probably my favorite line in the book comes in the last chapter where Thornton has lost all his fortune and is trying to uh, work with Margaret Hale to like finalize their business together because she has now become his landlord, and she would her lawyer has skipped this appointment, and she says, "Do you want to wait for him?" And he says, "I would rather not hear Mr. Lennox's opinions of my affairs. Those who are happy and successful themselves are too apt to make light of the misfortune of others." And I just thought that was like a wonderful, beautiful line in this book because I think that is kind of the way that everybody in the book kind of perceives everybody else in the book, and it just in there. And so I think that she was a very, very talented writer. There's just a lot of the things being the era that it's written for, where you have you have someone who's the brother is like somewhere else and he's can't enter the country, and this person is dying and that person is dying and this person is dying and that person is dying. They don't really resolve the plot of the brother, and there's a lot of fortunes that are inherited and all this stuff. So it's a lot that's going on, and you have to just accept that. And if you can accept that and put that aside, then I think that it's worth reading. If nothing else, you kind of just see the relationship between classes of people during this time and how Margaret Hale, is someone who kind of moves between them because of her station. Her father is a very educated person, but is also very poor. Where you have Thornton, who's very uneducated but has money, or at least he does in the beginning of the book. So I thought that that was interesting, and kind of the splits there. Now, how not everything is kind of one way or the other, or very rarely is it just one thing or the other thing. And so I thought that that was the most interesting part of it. Um, if you like Victorian era novels, obviously, then you'll probably enjoy this. I hear this is one of the better ones. But yeah, that's Elizabeth Gaskell's North and South. If you have read this book, please feel free to leave a comment in the comment section below. Like I said, I'm sure there are things that I didn't cover in it, and I'm sure there are things that went over my head, given the era that the book was written in the culture that it was written in. So if there's anything that was like really wrong that I said, which I'm sure there's at least one thing, please feel free to comment or clarify below. Like I said, it's a spoiler full review, so feel free to drop whatever you want. Yeah, until next time, thank you for watching. Please, if you've enjoyed this, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. I'll leave my Twitter link below for you checking out there. Until next time, bye.